Okay, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our webinar on lead-based paint exemptions in New York City, Becoming Lead-Free or Lead-Safe, an owner's guide to the lead-based paint exemption requirements and application process. This webinar is being hosted by HPD's Office of Enforcement and Neighborhood Services, also known as ENS for short. We are the office within HPD that employs uniformed staff such as housing safety inspectors and other professionals in order to make sure that New York City's housing stock is safe and healthy for all New Yorkers. My name is Phil Weitzman. I'll be your primary speaker for this morning's presentation. I am a senior trainer within ENS, and also joining us is Shireen Riazi-Kermani. She is ENS's lead compliance officer. Shireen, would you like to say hello?
Hi, everyone.
So before we get into the bulk of our presentation, we want to just take a quick tour of the webinar resources we have today. If you have joined us on a desktop computer, you will be seeing a screen or it's called a control pane that looks like this. Sometimes this pane may hide itself. If it does, you can click this orange arrow to open it up again. And the two features I want to show you are the handouts and the questions. We have attached 3 PDF handouts to this webinar, and you can take a look at those and download them at any time. If you need to communicate with us, you can use the questions or chat feature. Feel free to let us know at any point during the presentation if you have a question. We will answer them as we go where we're able to, and we have reserved time at the end for questions and answers. One note is that this presentation is being recorded. So for those of you who are watching the recording rather than joining us live, all of these handouts are also available on the HPD website. So that's another option for finding them, and we will show you where to find them towards the end of the presentation. So again, that was the desktop view. If you've joined us on a phone, you have the same access to questions and handouts. As you can see, the locations are a little different depending on whether you joined us through Android or iPhone, but you have the options regardless of which device you have used to join us. Let's also take care of a quick disclaimer. This presentation is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. If you need legal advice, we'd advise you to consult with a lawyer. And this presentation is not a complete statement of building owners' responsibilities relating to lead-based paint or any other topic. Jumping down to the bottom bullet here, this presentation is really intended as a general guide to the exemption process and the lead-based paint rules under New York City's laws. But as a building owner, ultimately you are responsible for complying with the law. So please be sure to read all of the instructions carefully and do your best to use your own judgment to take some of the suggestions and tips we give you here in order to fully comply. Just a few other notes. Our target audience here for this webinar are building owners who have some familiarity with the lead-based paint rules. That was the audience we had in mind when we designed this. If you are new to this topic, there's going to be a lot of information. You may have trouble keeping up with all of it, but that's okay. All of our previous webinars are available online to watch, and there are plenty of ways that you can catch up if you need to, and you will still learn a lot today as well. One other note, our topic today is New York City's Local Law 1 of 2004 and its amendments. Other applicable laws are discussed here and there in our other webinars, federal, state, and other regulations. But our topic today is the New York City requirements. So what are we going to discuss today? First, we're going to provide some more general information. We're just going to review what are all of owners' responsibilities under New York City's lead law. What are some of those responsibilities that you may be seeking an exemption from? Then we're going to give an important update on a change to the threshold for what constitutes lead-based paint under the law. This is very important for pursuing an exemption and really for any other aspect of complying with New York City's Local Law 1. This was a recent change, so we're going to give you some information about that. And then we'll move into today's main topic, exemption. What is an exemption? What are the different kinds of exemption and how you can apply? And then at the end, we'll share some additional resources, some final thoughts, and we will have time designated for questions and answers. Before we move into the presentation, we'd like to get to know you just a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and send out a quick poll and just let us know, have you watched any of our webinars before? And how did you join us? So just take a moment and let us know. I see a lot of votes coming in. All right, and I'm going to close the polls in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And let's take a look at our results. Okay, it looks like most of us are joining us for the first time. And it's great to have you here. Thank you for joining. As I mentioned before, this webinar was designed with a somewhat more advanced audience in mind. It's good for me to know that you have all, that many of you have joined for your first time. I'm going to keep that in mind as I explain all of the facets of exemptions. But if it is your first time joining, you may, there's going to be a lot of information. It may be a little bit hard to keep up, and you should know that that's to be expected. Lead-based paint is a very involved topic, and so if you are having a little trouble keeping up with this being the introduction to your topic, that's okay. And really that means that you are learning the topic as it is to be learned, because it can be a little bit complicated. So let's go over building owners' responsibilities under New York City's lead law. Just a quick note, when we talk about New York City's lead law, we're generally talking about this law I keep mentioning. You'll hear me say Local Law 1, Local Law 1 of 2004. What I'm really talking about is Local Law 1 of 2004 and its amendments. So the bulk of New York City's current regulations for lead in residential housing come from Local Law 1 of 2004, which added some new requirements to the city's administrative code. And subsequently, there have been a number of smaller but still significant amendments to that law. And we'll also talk about an additional law, and I'll mention that one when we get to it, Local Law 31. So one key thing to understand in understanding Local Law 1 of 2004 is the concept of the presumption of having lead-based paint. Under Local Law 1, based on certain criteria, a building owner and the city is required to presume, or we could also say assume, that there is lead-based paint in a building, even if no testing has been done either way. So based on these criteria, even if it isn't known whether there is lead-based paint in the building, you will have to presume that there is lead-based paint. And so let's talk about what those factors are. The two of the most important are dates. On January 1st, 1960, New York City banned lead-based paint. And then on January 1st, 1978, the federal government banned lead-based paint. As you learn about lead-based paint regulations, you'll see these two dates come up again and again. So under Local Law 1, we presume that paint has lead content if the building was built prior to the date where New York City banned lead-based paint, where a child under 6 years old resides in a unit. And we have a special definition of resides here. It means the child lives in the unit or routinely spends 10 hours or more per week. So in some cases, a child might be said to reside in the unit under New York City law, even if that's not their primary residence. It may be that they are, do 15 hours of babysitting in that unit. They would still be said to reside under the law. And the other factor is that the building can be either a multiple dwelling, which means there are 3 or more residential units, or a private dwelling with a tenant other than the owner or the owner's family living in a unit. This inclusion of private dwellings is new. Until February of 2021, private dwellings were exempt from most of the provisions of Local Law 1, except for the turnover requirements, which we'll mention in just a bit. But as of February of last year, private dwellings are now included in all of the provisions and requirements of Local Law 1. Another way of putting this bullet number 3 is that all of the provisions of Local Law 1 apply to any residential building with a unit that is not occupied by the owner or the owner's family. So if these criteria apply in your building, then you will have to presume that there is lead-based paint in that building. But another thing to understand is that it is not considered a violation of the law simply to have lead-based paint in a building under Local Law 1. The law focuses on lead-based paint that is considered to pose a hazard. So as long as lead-based paint remains covered up under layers of intact non-lead-based paint, it is not considered to be an immediate danger. It would still be better if it's not there, but it's not considered an immediate danger. The two major concerns that we see throughout Local Law 1, and there are a lot of specific ways these concerns are addressed, but these are really the two factors of greatest concern, are where the paint becomes deteriorated or it's on a high-risk surface where it is likely to deteriorate, and where a child could be exposed, because children are the population who are at severe risk of damage from lead-based paint in the quantities present in normal residential housing. So again, if you have lead-based paint in your building, you are not in violation of the law just from that presence. The violations are going to come in when that paint becomes a hazard, and where you may, if you end up having trouble complying with some of the specific requirements of the law. So what does the law require of building owners? Well, there are some actions that are required to prevent hazards from happening, and some actions required to correct them if they have occurred. Most of us in New York City are familiar with the annual notice to tenants to find out where all the children under 6 are in residential units, and then the required follow-up investigation to find deteriorated paint and other hazards in any unit where there is a child under 6. So this is an example of how the law asks building owners to prevent problems. There are also a number of steps required on turnover, which means when an apartment is vacant, the owner has to do an investigation and potentially do some remediation or abatement work as well. If you're curious about turnover, you can take a look at we have an entire webinar just on the topic of turnover. And similarly, we have a webinar on annual notice and record keeping if you'd like to learn more about those topics. Once you have identified that there's a hazard, either due to one of your required investigations or through any other source of information, such as a tenant complaint, for instance, of a leak, then as a building owner, you are responsible for remediating or abating those hazards. So that's pretty obvious. Once we find the problem, we need to fix it. And when we do any work that's going to disturb more than 2 square feet of lead-based paint, or paint where we don't know if there's lead within a room, now we have to hire EPA certified contractors who are going to follow safe work practices. We can see an example of safe work practices here on the right, some plastic sheeting to prevent dangerous lead-based paint dust within the work site from exiting the work site and placing a tenant at risk. So that's just one example of safe work practices. If you have questions about those, we have a recorded webinar on safe work practices as well. An important point about safe work practices is to note that they are required for any work that disturbs lead-based paint. So in some cases, it may be that we are specifically concerned about the dangers of lead, and that's why we're doing the work. In other cases, it may be we have a different concern, for instance, a plumbing or electrical issue. But if that work is going to disturb the more than 2 square feet of lead-based paint, we will need to use safe work practices. Another requirement we want to brief you on comes from a separate law, Local Law 31 of 2020, which set a deadline for 2025 for building owners to test all of their rental units to identify any lead-based paint that exists on any surface or component in those units. There's an additional deadline which says that if a child under 6 comes to reside in the unit, then the testing must be done within 1 year, or if the August 2025 deadline is sooner than before that deadline. Because testing is required for all units anyway, this is a good time to be thinking about exemption while you take care of this testing, because testing is the essential first step in any exemption. So as those testing results come in, you're going to be getting a lot of information that will cue you up in pursuing an exemption for that unit. So it's a great idea to be familiar with these rules and be thinking about them as the results come in so that you can be analyzing those results appropriately and hopefully applying for exemptions for those units. Now, there's a common question that we get this question in every webinar, and it's specifically relevant to today's topics. And we always get many versions of this question, so we wanted to answer it very directly up front. The question sounds like this. My building was built before 1960, but it was gut renovated. So I believe that there is no lead-based paint in my building. Do local law 1 responsibilities still apply to my building? And the answer is yes. This concept of the presumption of lead-based paint applies to all pre-1960 buildings, even if you believe that there is no lead-based paint. So the only date and the only piece of information that is relevant for the presumption of lead-based paint is the building built date on the certificate of occupancy. The date of a revised certificate of occupancy is not going to be relevant. Any records of gut renovation that you have, those are not going to be relevant. The building built date is what triggers that presumption of lead-based paint. One thing to keep in mind here is that even in buildings or units that are gut renovated, some painted components such as risers, radiators, and door and window frames may still be reused. That is one concern to keep in mind. But regardless of any specifics in your building, under the law, this pre-1960 date is what establishes that presumption. So this always leads us to a follow-up question, which we, of course, very much understand, where owners tell us, well, I'm still sure that there's no lead-based paint in a unit in my building or in my whole building. So is there anything I can do to reduce my responsibilities? And the answer is yes. The law provides for you to test to prove that the lead-based paint is not present. So you can arrange for testing, you can prove that the lead-based paint is not present. And as we discuss the topic of exemptions, we'll talk about how that proof that you have collected can benefit you and reduce your responsibilities under local law 1. Okay, now before we get into the topic of exemptions, I had promised that we were also going to give you an update on the new stricter threshold for testing to identify lead-based paint in units in your building. So previously, lead-based paint had been defined as material containing 1.0 milligrams per centimeter squared or greater. And as of December 1st of last year, the threshold was reduced by half to 0.5 milligrams of lead per square centimeter. So let's talk a little bit about what that's going to mean for building owners in New York City. Any XRF testing done to identify lead-based paint under the new threshold must be done with machines that are specifically reprogrammed and set to this new testing action level. So any testing that was done previously before this new testing action level was in play, before any devices had been approved to test it, any of those testing results do not satisfy this requirement. If the machine was programmed to test at the action level of 1.0 at the old standard, those results cannot be used for the new standard. This is because XRF machines are highly precise and technical in the way that they produce their results. And unless they're specifically programmed to be sensitive to the new action level, they are not considered to be sufficiently precise and accurate to provide results that pass muster under the law. So any previous results you may have received for units within your buildings that were produced by analyzers programmed for that previous threshold, those results can't be used. In many cases, those results may have said that the lead content was below 0.5. They may have said 0.4 or 0.3, 0.2, but those results still aren't considered to be usable under this new standard.
Hey, Phil, it's Shireen.
Yes.
I just wanted to pop in because I do see questions coming in really related to this threshold. And I wanted to make sure folks were aware that one of the handouts attached does have a document named lead-based paint threshold, FAQs. That document is also available on our lead-based paint website. And I just want to make sure that folks know that that is there, and it has a lot of the questions and answers that you may be having about this change in threshold. So just wanted to make sure folks are aware that there is that additional resource, since maybe not all of your questions about the threshold change may be answered during this webinar.
Yeah, thank you, Shireen. That's a great point. That is a very thorough document. So if we don't get to your questions today, we definitely will refer you to that. And I will make a point to just show it to everybody at the end of the webinar to remind you that it's there to answer your questions as well. So one other thing to mention about the new threshold is that there are now 3 possible results. 2 of them will be extremely familiar. Negative means that the reading was below the definition of lead-based paint. Positive means that the reading was above the definition, so we're treating the paint as lead-based. But we have a new result called inconclusive. If the machine produces a result that reads exactly at the threshold of 0.5, the machine is considered, or that result, I should say, is considered to be inconclusive. It means that the result is very, very close to being positive, but we are not able to say with sufficient precision that it is. The result is still going to be presumed to be positive. For all intents and purposes, it's going to be treated to be positive, but you would have the option to arrange for paint chip laboratory analysis, where a worker would actually collect a chip of paint and send it to a lab. That is a method that is considered to be accurate precisely at that threshold if that is something that you want to arrange for. So that is an option for you. But practically speaking, unless you want to take up that option, if there's an inconclusive result, it's going to be treated as a positive result. Now, some of you may be asking the question, well, what about any old test results I have collected? Those results do still satisfy the requirement to have all units tested by 2025. So if you had already begun complying with that requirement and collected test results at the old action level, then that still suffices to show that you have complied with this law requiring you to test all of your units. As a reminder, of course, any testing that took place after the new threshold took effect, after December 1st, 2021, must have been done at the new action level. So any test after that point cannot be used to fulfill this requirement. But for the other requirements of local law 1, those test results can't be used going forward. They can't be used to say that there's no paint on a component in a unit or in a common area, and you cannot use them to apply for an exemption. A little bit later, we will also talk about what happens with exemptions that have already been granted based on testing at that old threshold. So we'll come back around to that topic as well. But basically, those old test results are really only useful in complying with the requirement to test all units going forward. They can't be used for the other aspects of local law 1. And so for the rest of this presentation, unless we say otherwise, assume when we talk about test results being positive or negative, that we are referring to the new 0.5 milligrams per centimeter squared threshold. Okay, let's move into the main topic this morning. What is a lead exemption? We'll talk about the advantages of exemption, and then we'll go through talk about the different kinds of exemption and how you can apply. So an exemption makes the presumption of lead-based paint inapplicable to the unit or building to which the exemption applies. And this means that certain provisions of Local Law 1 of 2004 and its amendments will not apply to that unit or building. So some of those responsibilities that we reviewed at the beginning of this presentation, you will be exempt from those responsibilities. One thing to mention is that exemptions can only be issued to pre-1960 buildings. There is a small, I won't say small, but a relatively specific situation under the law where a building built between 1960 and 1978 could also be subject to the requirements of Local Law 1 if there's actual knowledge of lead-based paint in the building. And no exemptions are available for that situation because that situation is not called a presumption of lead-based paint. So The short version of what I just said is that exemptions are only issued to buildings built before 1960. If you are dealing with lead-based paint compliance issues for a building built between 60 and 78, that is not going to be an option for you. So what happens in an exempt unit? That unit is going to have undergone extensive testing of every surface and component to show either that all of the surfaces and components are free from any lead-based paint, or some test results were positive for lead-based paint, but the owner addressed that situation by abating those surfaces and components. And there are two kinds of abatement. One kind is removing the paint or replacing the component. And the result of that situation is that there simply is no more lead-based paint in the apartment. Or you can make the paint safer by containing it or enclosing it or using a method entitled encapsulation. So that's the basic outline of how a unit becomes exempt. Again, because testing is required for all units in your buildings, it's a great time to think about exemption. As those results come in, you can take a look at them and start thinking about how you could go about pursuing an exemption for each unit based upon the results that you receive. Let's move along and let's go into some more detail about different kinds of exemptions. We're going to talk about lead-free versus lead-safe exemption. The difference here is going to be whether lead-based paint has been completely removed from the apartment or has been made safe. And then we'll also talk about the option to apply for exemptions on a unit-by-unit basis or for an entire building or apartment complex. Those are two decisions that you will be making as you consider your exemption options: lead-free versus lead-safe, an individual unit versus entire building or apartment complex. In order to look at the exemption process, let's take a view of this flow chart, which walks us through all the possibilities. Every exemption starts with testing to identify whether there's any lead-based paint in any component or surface within the apartment. This testing is typically done via XRF testing, and the component could be intact, it could be deteriorated. For the purposes of this testing, that doesn't matter. We're asking, does the component have lead-based paint? And hopefully, in some cases, there will be no lead-based paint found in that unit. And so that's going to make it very easy to apply for a lead-free exemption. You will only need to provide those test results. And I think for most building owners, that's going to be a very easy decision to go ahead and pursue that exemption, which is going to let HPD know that there's no lead-based paint in that unit, and then you will enjoy all the benefits of exemption with no cost other than the cost of that testing. But in some cases, you will find that there is lead-based paint in the unit. And now you're going to want to have a discussion with your abatement contractor about your options. One option is going to be permanently removing that lead-based paint, as I said, by either removing the paint itself or replacing the components the paint has adhered to. If you remove all of the paint, your end result is the same as the previous one I described. You will get a lead-free exemption, showing that there is no more lead-based paint in that unit. In some cases, you may instead opt to make the paint safer without completely removing it. And so if you used methods with that intention, then you are going to arrive at a lead-safe exemption, which is a different status, and we'll talk about the differences between lead-free and lead-safe in terms of the benefits to owners in just a little bit. One other thing I wanted to mention is that anytime work is done that disturbs lead-based paint, including as you're pursuing an exemption, clearance is going to be required. Clearance is part of safe work practices. And what clearance means is that the contractor has cleaned up the work site of dangerous dust, and a separate contractor has been hired to test the work site to prove that lead-based paint dust has been removed. That usually this happens through dust wipe samples, which are mailed to an independent laboratory. So clearance is always going to be an essential part of the abatement process as you pursue any exemption and as you do any work where safe work practices are going to apply. So to review, a lead-free exemption means that there's no lead-based paint in the apartment, either because testing proved that there had never been lead-based paint to begin with, or testing showed that there were some surfaces and components that had lead, but those surfaces were abated in a way that completely removed the lead from the apartment. Let's go into a little bit more detail about what lead safe means. In a lead safe exemption, as I said, there is still lead in the apartment, but that lead has been made safer. And the two methods that could be used for a lead safe exemption are called containment or encapsulation. For containment, the lead-based paint surface is completely covered up, enclosed, and sealed with sheetrock or another type of durable material. For encapsulation, there's a special coating that is applied that needs to stick to the lead-based paint surface. And there are a few additional details to keep in mind for encapsulation. Encapsulation is not permitted on high-risk surfaces, meaning chewable, binding, friction, impact, or heat surfaces. A heat surface might be like a radiator, something like that. And additional licenses are required for a worker to apply an encapsulant. So you're going to want to have a discussion with your contractor about which of these options may work for you and for your unit. They're both have benefits and drawbacks depending upon the type of lead-based paint situation that you're dealing with. And so you can discuss those with the contractor that you are working with. One important thing to note about the lead safe exemption is that because there is still lead in the apartment, there are requirements to continue monitoring the work that had been done to make that lead safer. HPD has set forth some minimum requirements for the monitoring plan that mirror the guidelines of the US Department of Housing and Urban Development. And so at a minimum, the monitoring is going to involve a yearly inspection of those components by the building owner or manager, as well as an inspection every 2 years by an EPA certified risk assessor, and keeping 10 years of records showing compliance with that monitoring plan. Another thing to note about the monitoring plan is that if you want to keep the exemption active for that apartment, you will be required to maintain that monitoring plan and continue following it, even if the child under 6 moves out of the apartment, and so there's no child living there. If you want to maintain that exemption, you'll have to continue following the steps outlined in the monitoring plan. So those are the basic outlines of the two kinds of exemption. Let's talk about the benefits of each. So the lead-free exemption provides more advantages for a building owner, which makes intuitive sense, I think. We've shown that there is no lead-based paint in the unit. That obviously provides a greater degree of assurance and peace of mind. So one advantage of the lead-free exemption is that we know we've done absolutely everything possible to protect tenants from lead-based paint. Taking a look at this bullet at the bottom, from a risk management perspective, this provides the best protection for you because you know that there's absolutely no lead-based paint in that unit. Hopefully this wouldn't happen, but if the tenant tests positive for elevated lead blood levels, you would know with a great degree of certainty that that did not happen based on the units or areas that were exempt in your building. Now, aside from keeping your tenants safe, the advantages of lead-free exemption is that it reduces your responsibilities. So you no longer will have to do the annual notification and investigation in your unit. You will not have to hire EPA certified contractors to use safe work practices in that unit. There will be no required turnover investigation or turnover work. Of course, it will mean that you have satisfied the testing requirements because testing was the first step. And you will not have to keep any more ongoing records. So based on all of these factors, this should provide you with a long-term cost savings by exempting you from all of these different requirements. So it's a great benefit to any building owner to have a lead-free exemption. The main disadvantage that some building owners may find is that if work is required to obtain this lead-free exemption, work that completely removes the lead-based paint tends to be more expensive than work that makes the paint safe. So removing the paint or replacing the components may be more expensive, and that higher upfront cost may be a disadvantage for some building owners. I should remind everyone, though, that if your testing shows that there is no lead-based paint in the unit to begin with, then that disadvantage does not apply. Then I think for most building owners, it should be a very easy decision to go ahead and apply for this lead-free exemption and reduce your responsibilities. Now let's talk about the LeadSafe exemption. Now, because this exemption makes the paint safer but does not completely remove it, the advantages are fewer, although they are still significant. So under a LeadSafe exemption, you will be exempt from the annual notification and investigation and turnover requirements, and you will have reduced record-keeping requirements. However, I should mention that in one sense, you are trading these requirements for a new one, because the LeadSafe work is now going to come with a monitoring plan that you will have to follow in order to maintain the exemption. So there will be some new responsibilities to keep track of. In addition, you will still have to engage in safe work practices if you're doing work that disturbs those components. But the monitoring plan and the safe work practices requirements will apply only to those components that were made lead safe. So depending upon the number of components that you are doing work on in that apartment, the amount of additional responsibilities that you get that come with this monitoring plan and with the specific features of that apartment may still be significantly reduced in a lead safe apartment. You will also, the big advantage for many people with a lead safe exemption is simply that there are lower upfront costs, as I had mentioned previously. In some cases, it may be that only a lead safe exemption is feasible for you right now. You could always pursue that now and then have a two-part process where down the line you pursue a lead-free exemption. Another thing to note is that in certain situations, it may not be possible to completely remove the paint. One example would be if there is an exposed lead pipe, or excuse me, to remove the lead. If you have an exposed lead pipe being one example. So in a situation like that, the lead safe option may be the only one available to you. That's something that you can discuss again with your contractor as you talk about the scope of work that you're going to do to pursue your exemption. Now, the other decision that you may have when pursuing an exemption is whether you want to pursue that exemption on a unit by unit basis or for an entire building or an apartment complex. An apartment complex, by the way, is a set of buildings that were built at the same time with the same management history, and so basically they share the whole history. And you will swear to that when you submit your exemption application, that these buildings have basically been treated in the same way for the history that they have existed. If you apply for an exemption for a building or apartment complex, you have a few different options. As you can see here, it's important to note that the exemption for dwelling units, for all of the dwelling units in a building, only applies to buildings with 21 units or more. So that will not be an option for buildings with fewer units than 21. Exemptions for buildings and apartment complexes are granted only when testing is done on a statistical number of random units. So this is a process that is set out in the HUD guidelines, how to randomly select and test units and components within the building. And the advantage of this method is that you have lower upfront costs because you are only testing a percentage of your units rather than all of them. However, there is a major disadvantage, which is that if lead-based paint is subsequently found in any of those units, the exemption is revoked. So maybe HPD or the Department of Health will come in and do some testing. If they find that there is a positive result, then all of the exemptions for all of those units will be revoked. So just to imagine a simple scenario, if you had a building with 100 units, 99 of them didn't have any lead, but one unit did, and you do a building-wide exemption, if lead is found in that one unit, you will then lose the exemption for all of those units. So there's always a risk that through random sampling, you're going to miss whatever lead does exist in the building. That is less safe for your tenants, and it causes a situation where the entire exemption can be thrown out. So it's often advantageous to test and submit your exemption applications on a unit by unit basis to prevent that issue. Okay, we're going to do a few polls just to review some of what we've talked about. And so I'm going to go ahead and launch this next poll and just let us know, what answer do you recall for which type of exemption will be granted if all the lead-based paint is permanently removed from the apartment? So go ahead and take a second to vote. And I'll give it about 5 more seconds here. It's perfectly okay to give it your best guess if you aren't sure. This is really just to change up the format and give you a chance to think back over what we have discussed. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And let's see. Okay, great. 88% of us got the correct choice, which is that the lead-free exemption means that all of the lead-based paint has been permanently removed from the apartment. The LeadSafe exemption means that lead is still in the apartment, but it has been made safer through abatement methods. Okay, let's move along, and we're going to talk about how to apply for an exemption. So let's review how far we've come. We talked about all of the requirements of Local Law 1 at the beginning of this presentation, so we have a sense of what those requirements are, and we know that testing is required for every unit. So let's pretend we have our test results. We've tested every unit, and we've gone over the different exemption options. We know which kinds of exemptions we want to apply for our units based upon those test results. And now we are going to apply in order to reduce our responsibilities. We're going to talk about a few items to take care of before applying. We're going to go over the application, and then we're going to review all of the supporting documentation that's going to be required in that application. And at the end of this section, we'll also briefly discuss situations where an exemption might be revoked, just to mention that as well now. So before you apply for an exemption, if your building is required to register with HPD, then it must be validly registered. So that's something that you will have to take care of. I'm guessing that for this audience, that is not going to be a concern because we got in touch with you using the email address associated with your registration. So this audience is already keeping up with their registration, and we thank you for that. You will also have to resolve any open lead-based paint hazard violations from HPD where the inspector tested a surface and that test came back positive. So you will have to clear those violations before you can apply for an exemption. And the order numbers are listed here on this slide. Let's talk about the application. The best advice that we can give you is to read all of the instructions very carefully. Be sure that you understand those instructions and get answers to any questions you may have about them. This is also the advice that we give to building owners in relation to any other communication from HPD, such as a notice of violation. The instructions have a lot of valuable information, and it's very important to read them all carefully in order to ensure that your submissions to HPD are accepted by our clerical staff. So we will talk about the application itself. As you'll see, it's actually quite short. There aren't that many things to fill out on the application itself. The bulk of your application is going to consist of supporting documentation, showing your testing results and documenting any work that was done to pursue your exemption. Aside from the relatively short application form, there is a detailed set of instructions for you as a building owner, and there is a set of instructions for you to provide to the contractors that you may hire, the testing, abatement, dust sampling, or encapsulation contractors. And there are some affidavits that the contractors will have to fill out. This application is one of the handouts for this webinar. Again, it is also available on the HPD website, and I'll show you where to find it at the end of this presentation. Let's go ahead and take a quick look at the application document. I apologize if this is a little small to read. I mostly want to summarize this here for you so you can see your application section where you're going to provide some information on your building. You're going to basically explain all of the decisions that you made in which type of exemption you'd like to pursue. So lead-free with abatement, lead-free without abatement, or lead-safe. There's a detailed list of all the documents you're going to have to attach based upon the kind of exemption that you are pursuing, and we'll continue reinforcing this, but you'll see that different kinds of exemption have different amounts of documentation that are required based upon the amount of work that had to be done in order to obtain that exemption. And one important detail is that the application has to be notarized. The affidavits your contractor fill out have to be notarized as well. Making sure that all notarization details are complete and accurate is one very important thing for making sure that any submission to HPD succeeds. And then you'll see there's a very long set of instructions here for you, as well as some instructions for you to share with the building owner, for you to share with your contractor, and some affidavits at the end for them to fill out, as I had previously mentioned. Okay, back to our slideshow. Before we move on though, we want to highlight one of the most important features of applying for exemption, which is that it is completely free. So there is no cost associated aside from the costs of the testing and any other work you may have had to do to apply for the exemption. And again, to review as we talk about what documents are required, we'll just look at this flow chart again. So no matter what, our exemption process always starts with some testing. If no lead-based paint is found, then that gets us all the way to our lead-free exemption. If lead-based paint is found, then we may pursue permanent removal of that lead-based paint, or we may make the paint safer through approved methods. Either way, clearance of the work site is going to be required to make sure that it is safe for the tenants to reoccupy. And as we'll see, depending upon the method used to make the paint safe, there may be some additional documentation required as well. So let's look at all this required documentation one more way. You can see all four kinds of exemption here. A lead-free exemption where there's no paint in the apartment and no abatement was required because the paint just wasn't there to begin with. Or a lead-free exemption where some abatement work had to be done to remove that paint. And then we can see the two kinds of lead-safe exemptions. Lead-safe that used only containment as a method, in other words, encapsulation wasn't used, and lead-safe where encapsulation was used. So let's use this table to build up the documents that are going to be required based on which type of exemption we are pursuing. So for every type of exemption, of course, the application document will be required. And for every type of exemption, we're going to need to provide testing records because that is the crucial first part of any exemption. Now, if abatement work had to be done, then we are going to need documents from the abatement contractor, as well as clearance documents showing that dust wipe samples were taken and the results of those samples proving that the worksite was properly cleaned up. If we are doing a lead-safe exemption, we're also going to need to include the monitoring plan in the application and some details about that. And if encapsulation was used, we're going to need to provide some information from the contractor who applied the encapsulant, because there are some additional requirements around applying encapsulation, which again, encapsulation is the work method where a gel is applied to the lead-based paint, and that gel needs to stick to that lead-based paint. One thing I'll mention right here as well is that if encapsulation is used, the monitoring plan is going to require you to check that encapsulant more often in the first, I believe it's about the first year, in order to ensure that that encapsulant is properly adhering to the lead-based paint surface. So really quickly, we can just look at this one more way by seeing the kinds of application paperwork required for each type of exemption. So if it's lead-free with no abatement required, we simply need the application itself and the testing records. If abatement was required, we're also going to need the records from the abatement firm and from the clearance firm. If we're pursuing a lead-safe exemption, we're also going to need the monitoring plan. And if encapsulation was also used in that LeadSafe exemption, we'll need those documents from the worker who applied the encapsulant. Okay, let's do another quick poll just to review what we covered just now. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll, and you can let us know which type of application for exemption requires the least amount of documentation. So again, you can go ahead and vote if you aren't sure. Feel free to give it your best guess. These questions are just a way for us to change the format up a little bit and give you a chance to think back over the material that we just covered. Okay, I'm going to close the polls in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And let's look at how everybody voted. And great, 91% of us got the correct choice, which is that the lead-free exemption, where no abatement was required, requires the least amount of documentation. So for that type of exemption, all that's required is the application itself, as well as the testing records. For the other kinds of exemptions, you're also going to need to provide additional documentation around any work that was done and any monitoring follow-up that may be required. I had mentioned previously that we would discuss the fact that lead exemptions can be revoked. So the lead exemption status from HPD is not permanent, and this is something to be aware of. The exemption can be revoked, you could also say removed, if there is new evidence of lead-based paint. So HPD inspectors, as well as the Department of Health potentially, will still be doing lead-based paint inspections in apartments that have an exemption. However, if you have the exemption, it should, the test results should come back negative. If, however, HPD or the Department of Health learned that there is a lead-based paint surface in that exemption, then they will issue a violation and then the exemption would be revoked. The exemptions also are revoked if the lead safe work that was done fails. A classic situation would be a leak that compromises the containment or the encapsulation, or if the building owner has not been keeping sufficient records to show that they're following the required monitoring plan for checking to make sure that the containment or encapsulation has remained effective. Now, as a reminder, if you have applied for an exemption for an entire building or apartment complex, if any part of the exemption for that complex has been removed based on these three factors, then the entire exemption will become revoked and all of the requirements of Local Law 1 will immediately apply to the entire building. There's an additional situation where an exemption could be revoked, and this brings us back to the information we provided you about the new testing threshold. So let's look at that in the next slide. As this threshold is rolled out, there's the question of what to do with exemptions that were granted based upon testing that had been done at the previous threshold. And so the way that those exemptions are treated is that they remain active until the next vacancy. So those exemptions are active until the tenant moves out, or until the first time a tenant moves out after December 1st, 2021. This is an automatic process, so it means as soon as that previously exempt apartment becomes vacant again, the exemption is automatically revoked. In addition, as the building owner, you have a responsibility to notify HPD so that HPD can update its records. But again, it's important to be clear that whether or not you communicate with HPD, the exemption has automatically become revoked. and all of the requirements of local law 1 will apply. The form for letting HPD know when that vacancy occurs is available as one of the handouts to this webinar. It's also available on our website if you'd like to find it there. And so just to reinforce what revoked means, revoke is a word that means to cancel or to take back, to remove. And so once the exemption is revoked, all of the local law 1 requirements immediately apply to the unit again. So if you want to renew or have a new exemption, you will have to arrange for new testing at the new threshold and then go through the process of applying for that exemption based on your new testing results. One point worth emphasizing is that the turnover requirements will apply immediately at that next turnover. So just to provide an example, let's say that I'm a building owner. I had a unit that received an exemption 5 years ago, well before I knew about that this new threshold was coming up. And now I know that there's going to be a vacancy on March 1st. On March 1st, I will have to begin fulfilling all of the local law 1 requirements for that unit, the annual notice and investigation, safe work practices, et cetera. And that includes the turnover investigation on that first vacancy that's going to occur on March 1st in my imaginary example. Okay, we've covered all of our main material, and now we'll leave you with some additional resources and thoughts before we turn it over for questions and answers. So for much more information, you can visit our website at nyc.gov/lead-based-paint. I'll just emphasize those 2 hyphens again, because those are important. If you do not put the hyphens in, you'll actually go to a different New York City website about lead-based paint. So if you want to be sure to find HPDs, remember to type those hyphens in. And of course, it's very easy to Google HPD's lead-based paint page as well if you'd rather find it on a search engine. And the documents that I have been mentioning are available under owner responsibilities and under the exemptions tab on that website. Aside from exemptions, there is much more to learn. And as you can see from the menu on the left, we have a lot of information. We'd encourage you in particular to take a look at 2 items, our briefings, which is where we provide that's usually where we provide the absolute latest news, the most recent news that has come out, as well as recordings of all of our webinars. As I had mentioned earlier, by registering for this webinar, you signed up to receive an email. It should appear within about 24 hours after we end this webinar, which will have a link to watch this video again. We will also be posting this video on the HPD website if you'd prefer to find it there, and it is available on, it's hosted on YouTube, so you can find it directly on YouTube as well. So if you are just getting started with this topic, there are a lot of webinars that you can watch in order to catch up. It is a lot of information, but it is there for you to begin learning all of this, all of these lead-based paint topics. Now, as we think ahead to our question and answer section, one thing we want to mention is that we won't be able to answer questions for you about your specific situation. So any question that, let's see, just having a slight technical difficulties here where my screen was just flickering. Pardon me, everybody. Okay, it seems like the problem is solved. So if you want to ask a question about your particular building, any question that's going to start with the date your building was built and what to do about a specific violation, for instance, you should call our lead-based paint unit at 212-863-5501. They're going to be the ones who can help you with those questions, and we won't be able to answer them during our Q&A today. A lot of times as we conclude these webinars, we hear from people who are only realizing during the webinar that they haven't been following all of the lead-based paint rules. Our advice to you in that situation, there are a few things we can mention. Obviously, it's not a great situation to be in. It could be better if you had already been following the rules, but there are some steps you can take. We'd encourage you to compile whatever records you do have of work done to address lead-based paint issues, records of repairs such as invoices, emails, descriptions of work, records of any testing that has been done. Now, the fact is that if you have not been complying with the rules and you don't have the records to show that you have been doing so, that if HPD does select your building as one of the buildings that it's going to audit for lead compliance, you will receive a violation. Now, as with any HPD violation, the way to correct the violation is going to be for you to show that you have fixed the issue going forward. So if you don't have records from 5 years ago, you can't conjure them up out of thin air anymore. You will have a chance to show HPD that you have corrected the issue going forward. So that's how the situation would be treated. And something to keep in mind is that these 10 years of required records are very important. So if you purchase a building, make sure to ask the seller about those records so you can be sure to obtain them. And if the seller, if the previous owner didn't have those records, there is a process you can follow. You can call the lead-based paint unit for more details about that. As I just mentioned, we have lots more information in our webinars, and we have more webinars to come. Stay tuned and check your email for announcements about additional webinars. And again, our lead-based paint unit is there to help you with your personal questions at 212-863-5501. One last thing to mention before our questions and answers, we'll be sending out a survey. Once you log off from the webinar, please take a moment to let us know how we are doing. We would love to get your feedback. We always read it very carefully because we want to make sure that these webinars are as helpful as they can possibly be for you. And I had already mentioned that the video recording will be available. Okay, I think it's time to answer some of your questions. Shireen, what questions have you seen coming in?
A lot. So we're getting hit with a lot of questions.
Yes, and I will just
yeah, go ahead.
Just to mention to everybody, we have about 300 people joining us this morning. So we do apologize if we don't get to your question. We will answer as many as we can. Back to you, Shireen.
Yeah, and just a little more housekeeping on that. Right now, I'm going to try to, and I've been sorting through your questions. We have a lot of duplication, so I might not be answering your specific question, but general topics. Also, I'm trying to focus on questions that are specifically about the topic of exemption. We're getting a lot of questions about the local law 31 requirement of 2020. I would encourage you to look at the FAQ. I think a lot of your questions will be answered with the FAQ. We'll get to those questions if we run out of exemption questions. And then we do have some that are off topic that we'll get to only if we have time available. But again, please check out our website. There's a lot of resources there, answers to a lot of these questions that are there as well. And also one more thing just to mention, when you send in questions, if you're sending in two-part questions or follow-up questions, so a question you asked earlier, our screen doesn't group them together. So I apologize. I'm going to be going through these. I might get to a second part of your question later on here. So I just wanted to explain to you, when you send in multiple questions, it does not group them in an easy fashion for us to see. So after all of that, we are getting a ton of questions here. I do want to start off answering one that I think will answer about 10 folks that sent in a question. A lot of folks asking, where can I find someone to test the apartments? Does HPD provide a list? Is there a program through HPD to provide testers to come out to test? And since that is related to the process of exemption, I wanted to make sure to answer that for folks. Simply, the first question here about if HPD has a unit that provides the XRF testing. No, that is not a service provided directly by the agency. An owner has to hire a contractor. That contractor, the individual's certification, and this information is in the lead exemption application. It's in the details of the instructions. That individual who does the lead testing has to be an EPA certified lead inspector or an EPA certified risk assessor. That is their certification issuance. And they should be able to provide you a copy of their individual certification. And the firm that they work for also must have a firm certification called an EPA lead-based paint activity certification. If you go to the EPA website and look under their lead division, you click on the lead tab, it does have an online database that you can search. That's a voluntary database by local contractors. You can search by your zip code, by your city, by a name of a contractor on that web page. So that is a resource to try to find local contractors, but that is a voluntary database for contractors who are certified through EPA. But that is one good resource that you can find these types of certified contractors to do your testing, as well as those that can do your abatement, or if you are not looking to do a full abatement and you need to make sure that you are hiring a certified contractor to perform any work that would be disturbing paint, they also have those databases there. So I just want to encourage you to go to the EPA website. EPA is who certifies those contractors and can provide you some information on ones in our area. So I think that took care of about 10 folks' questions. I'm definitely going to be grateful for Phil in the background, who you just heard for, and we also have another colleague, Jesse, in the background, who are going to be helping me sort through questions, prioritize them as they continue to come in. So just going through your questions here as they were submitted, does the threshold not change? If the threshold does not change, does the exemption still become revoked? Just to provide some clarity again, the threshold that we're talking about, which defines what lead-based paint is in the city of New York, that has already changed. It went from 1.0 milligrams per centimeter squared to 0.5 milligrams per centimeter squared. And that went into effect December 1, 2021. And if you were granted an exemption at the threshold, the old threshold of 1.0, your exemption of a unit is revoked when that unit turns over. Any unit that turned over after December 1, 2021, that exemption is revoked. And there is an affidavit. You are required under local law 1 to actually report that turnover to HPD. And there is an affidavit, a form on HPD's website. And I believe it's also attached here to the webinar as one of the handouts. The affidavit that you would then submit that to HPD to inform us of that turnover. So I hope that explains a little bit more about how the threshold change affects any existing exemption that was granted under the previous definition of lead-based paint. Then we have a question that came in from Avi. Do you have to apply for lead exemption every year for a new tenant? For the most part, a lead exemption application is a one-time activity. Of course, what we've seen here were changes in the law changed the threshold. And so it is not a one-time activity now because of that change in the law. But this is not something that you are applying for exemption every single time there is a new tenant. What you are applying for exemption for is to show that the presumption of lead-based paint that local law 1 says exists for any building built prior to 1960 does not apply to your building or your unit or your common areas, whichever it is you are applying for exemption for. That is what the exemption is. The exemption is to show physical evidence, documented evidence to HPD that there is no lead-based paint in your pre-1960 built building. And if we grant that it then tells you that you are no longer subject to some of the specific requirements under local law 1. So I wanted to give clarity on that is what exemption is. And if you do not have to apply for exemption, it is not a requirement, but if you do not apply for exemption, then local law 1 applies. And you have to follow the requirements of local law 1. We did get a question here. I think folks saw the one question that Phil put out there about gut renovation. We did get a few questions about that still, and it just then to repeat that to you. If you did a gut renovation, great, but that in and of itself does not mean that you are exempted from local law 1. In order to demonstrate to HPD that you qualify for exemption, you have to have the testing done and submit that. Hopefully then your gut renovation included all components, all painted surfaces, and you can submit an exemption application for lead-free without any further abatement required. But the gut renovation in and of itself does not meet the requirement to show that you are exempt. You have to do the testing to show that there is no lead-based paint. So I wanted to touch on that topic again. Christopher, you had a few questions, and I might not be able to get these grouped together, but you were asking about abating on friction and impact surfaces. Do you have to just abate the parts that touch, like the edge of the door or the edge of the door frame? Christopher, I don't know if you are asking about abatement just in relation to turnover. That's not the topic area here. So I will answer this just as any surface that is within a unit or common area. If you are going to be applying for exemption, any painted surface or otherwise coated surface must be tested and demonstrated to be negative for lead-based paint. If it is positive or inconclusive, then the requirement will be that you have to perform abatement, hire a contractor to perform abatement to abate that painted surface, to either permanently remove, as in remove all of the paint from the component, or replace the entire component. So for example, your baseboard tests positive. Your options to be able to get a lead-free on a baseboard is to hire a certified abatement contractor, work with them on your best options, but your options for lead-free are to have them permanently remove any paint from that entire baseboard, or remove the baseboard and replace that if you wish on the baseboard there. And it's that sort of documentation on the abatement that our exemption unit will be looking for. They will look at your XRF, which is the testing document, your XRF report, and they will look for anything that shows that it's positive or inconclusive. And then they will need to have those records from you submitted by the certified abatement firm and their abatement workers who did the abatement. So they will look one for one. The baseboard tested positive. Do we have records submitted that show that the baseboard had the paint permanently removed, or it was removed, the baseboard itself was removed? So they're looking for that type of information. So yes, any sort of painted surface that is positive when it comes to exemption has to be fully abated. We do have more information related to turnover, Christopher, if your question is specifically about turnover and the requirements at turnover to abate window and door friction surfaces. Let's see here. As we're going through here, can you apply for exemption for the unit only and not the hallways? Or does the building have to be lead-free for applying for exemption? So let's take a step back then and talk about, there was a slide that Phil showed that said you could apply for an individual unit. So you can submit an exemption application for a single unit that has tested negative or tested positive, and you did either lead-free or lead-safe abatement on it. You can apply for that individual unit. You do not have to apply for the common areas of the building. You do not have to apply for the other units, but then those other units or common areas, if it's a pre-1960 building, they are subject to local law 1 requirements. So your exemption applies where you have been granted the exemption. So you can apply for an individual unit. You could apply only for the common areas of the building because you tested the common areas and they were all negative. You can apply then and say, my application is going to only be for the common areas. So that is an option for you. You can do an individual unit, you can do the common areas of the building, and was explained, you can do a sampling process if the building is more than 21 units. And that gets a little bit more complicated. And there are, some benefits and some challenges related to that sampling process that Phil touched on. And we'll see if we had any questions about that as we go through here as well.
Shireen, I'll jump in to answer a question. I've seen a few of these. Just to review something that we talked about at the very beginning of the presentation, which is the importance of the building built date. So some people are still working through comparing their building built date to the requirement. So to be brief, if your building was built after 1978, these requirements are not going to apply to you. If your building was built before 1960, then there is a presumption of lead-based paint in your building. And it's less likely that this will happen, but if your building was built between 1960 and 1978, if there's actual knowledge of lead-based paint in that building, then the requirements of local law 1 are going to apply. So if your building was built after 1978, you will know that, that the lead-based paint requirements are not going to apply to your building. If it was built between 60 and 78, it's something to be aware of, that if there is a positive test, that these requirements are going to apply. It's unusual, but because lead-based paint had not yet been banned in the country, there have been situations where the builders imported the paint into New York City and used it in New York City construction between 1960 and 78. And if your building was built before 1960, then the presumption of lead-based paint is applying, and that's where you may wish to apply for an exemption. So those are the different situations that you may find yourself in based on the date that your building was built. Back to you, Shireen.
Sure, that gave me a chance to kind of sort through some of the questions. David, I think you have a few questions in here. I think we answered one of yours that you were going through here, but I wanted to touch on your topic that you brought up, and it's about condos and co-ops. So I want to be clear, if anyone is on here that's dealing with condos and co-op management, a condo and co-op still falls under a multiple dwelling. It is subject to local law 1 if any unit in that condo or co-op building is not occupied by the owner or the owner's family. So I want to be very clear on that. So condo and co-op buildings built prior to 1960 can apply for an exemption as the building itself, or if you have an individual unit that you own or are a shareholder within a building, you are also allowed to apply for an individual unit exemption. So if you plan to rent out a unit that's within your unit within a condo or co-op, you can apply for an exemption, doing the testing, doing the abatements for your unit, and apply for exemption. But local law 1 and the requirements do apply to condo and co-op buildings if any of the units are not occupied by the owner or the owner's family. So I wanted to clarify that, and we do have information related to that written out on our website as well. If you needed to kind of hear that back or read that, it is on our website. So I wanted to touch on that topic because David, you had mentioned that you were as a part of a co-op. And then Hannah had a question about LeadFree exemption. I think she was trying to get some clarity here on the testing level and said, can you apply for a lead-free exemption if you have a 0.4 milligram or below test results? And yes, if it was tested using an instrument programmed at the 0.5 action level. What I just said there was probably very confusing to folks. And again, I will encourage you to look at the lead-based paint threshold FAQs. But one of the things that Phil touched on is this definition, this change in the threshold. What it requires then, in order to be able to test at this new threshold, the instrument itself has to have been issued what's called a performance characteristic sheet to show that it can test at the 0.5 threshold. So if you have past testing before this threshold went into effect, before instruments were reprogrammed to show that they can test at this lower level, your past testing, even if that past testing shows that you didn't have anything that tested at 0.5 or above, you cannot use those same results to show that it is negative for lead-based paint under the current threshold. So your old test results can no longer be used to demonstrate compliance with local law 1 or to exempt yourself from local law 1. So I wanted to at least provide some clarity there. It's not just on the testing, it's about the instrument itself that is doing the testing as well. So not just the number, but making sure that the instrument is one that has been reprogrammed and proven to be able to test at the lower level that we are testing at to define it as lead-based paint. Bill, any other questions you guys see?
Yeah, we had a question from Luis. He was asking, are owners allowed to use lead test kits? And Luis, what I think you're referring to, there are test kits that can be bought at a hardware store to test for lead-based paint. And those kits should not be used to comply with any portion of this law.
Correct.
You're certainly allowed to use them. They can give you a little bit of information. It doesn't hurt, but very important to only use approved testing methods. Generally, it's going to be what we call XRF testing. Yeah. That's the method of choice for most building owners.
Yeah, back to you. Yeah, I just wanted to mention, just to follow on that, very clearly in local law 1, you can only rebut the presumption of lead-based paint under local law 1 by testing performed by a certified inspector or risk assessor. Those two certifications I mentioned earlier, which is who you would be hiring to do the XRF testing. So this is not something where you can do a home test kit performed by the owner. So some clarity there as well. Let's see what we've got here in the queue. On the questions, Jeff, you had a question about the worker certifications. I hope I was able to answer your question about the testing, but you also talked about encapsulation. Encapsulation is a form of abatement. And so the certification required for that encapsulant, whoever is going to apply that encapsulant, it's going to be, again, a lead abatement firm and a certified lead abatement worker who is supervised by a lead supervisor. So it qualifies there as abatement. So when you are submitting an exemption application where it was encapsulant. One of the things Phil mentioned is that there's additional encapsulant documentation, and one of those is an affidavit that's completed by the lead abatement worker who did the encapsulant and certifies to having performed applied the encapsulant correctly, tells us the type of encapsulant. So it is an abatement activity there. We're getting into some questions here. Here's one I'm going to touch on. I think it's an important one. It's related to that local law 31 testing requirement. And it was specifically, I want to make sure there's some clarity here. Hugh had a question about even after 2025. So if you recall, local law 31 requires that all units be tested in pre-1960 housing or 60 to 78 if the owner already knows there is lead-based paint by 2025, August 2025 specifically. The units have to be tested sooner, within a year, if a child comes to reside. So if a child comes to reside, it has to be tested within a year. But the question that was being asked was, does this only apply to where a child under 6? So I wanted to give some clarity, is that local law 31 and this requirement to test all units applies regardless of the age of the occupant. So I think that was important to communicate, but again, more information is available on our website about local law 31 as well. Let's see here. Does local law 1 apply to 1 or 2 family homes? Again, I thought this was an important one to answer here, even though it's not specifically about exemption, but yes, a portion of it, only a portion of it used to apply to 1 to 2 family homes. And to be even more clear, this is a 1 to 2 family home where at least one of the units is not occupied by the owner or the owner's family. So if this is a 1-unit single family home and it's occupied by the owner, no, local law 1 does not apply. If this is a 2-family home and the owner occupies 1 unit, but a tenant occupies the other unit, then local law 1 does not apply to the unit that the owner occupies, but it does apply to the tenant in the other unit. And if there is a child under 6 in that unit, if you've done your annual notice and you identify that there's a child under 6 in that unit, then when you have to deal with your annual inspections, you also, if there's any common areas that tenant has access to, it applies to those common areas as well. And then similarly, I'm answering this question too, because if you have the exemption, you can apply for exemption for a 1 to 2 family home. So the law was expanded to include, have all of the requirements apply to 1 to 2 family homes in, I believe it was February of 2021. So now all of local law 1 applies to 1 to 2 family unit homes as well. Let's see here.
I see a question that came in from John. John asked a good question, and he just asked us to confirm that when we're talking about abating lead-based paint, and specifically when we talk about removing the paint from the apartment, we are talking about based on the new threshold, and that is correct, John. So I've been using the phrase remove all of the lead-based paint from the apartment, remove, phrases like that, saying that lead-free means that there is no lead-based paint in the apartment. And when I say that, I mean based on the current threshold of 0.5 milligrams per centimeter squared. Mm-hmm. If the threshold were to be lowered again, then we would have to take a new look at that apartment under the new threshold. There's no current indication that I'm aware of that there's no plans for that to happen. So when we talk about removing the lead paint, we're talking about the current definition of lead-based paint of 0.5 milligrams per centimeter squared. Back to you, Shireen.
Sure. Let's see here. Let's see if there's one that we can touch on here. I know I think we're a little over on time, aren't we, Phil?
We are. Maybe we can take,
Yeah.
let's say, 2 more questions.
So I'm trying to sort through here and see, we're running into a lot of duplicates. Let's see. A few folks, Phil touched on this already. We have Philip and Rita that are asking about buildings that are built after 1978. And again, as Phil said, we're focused on buildings built prior to 1978 here. So if your building was actually built, again, not just your certificate of occupancy, we're talking about your original built date. Anything built after 1978, then you are not concerned with local law 1. Let's see here. Trying to sort through these. Apologies.
Well, there's a question that has come up in several different ways that I'll mention here.
Sure.
Some people are telling us that they don't have any children living in their apartment, or excuse me, in their building. So they're asking about the applicability of local law 1 requirements.
Mm-hmm.
And the answer is that local law 1 will still apply to your building where there's a presumption of lead-based paint. Now, if there are no children in your building, there are a number of the requirements of local law 1 that are only triggered by the presence of a child. So for instance, you won't have to investigate any of your apartments for lead hazards annually based on the presence of a child. But there are some other requirements that are still going to apply. Safe work practices requirements don't depend upon the presence of a child. The turnover requirements don't depend on the presence of a child. So you may still wish to seek an exemption for units within your building, even if there are no children living in the building, and the details on exactly which requirements apply when there are no children, that's a large topic. We can't get into much detail here, but just to mention that even if no children live in your building, there are aspects of local law 1 that will still apply. Back to you, Shireen.
Yeah, and I just want to touch, there's a few folks that are talking about what's the cost related to, testing or abatement, and that's really going to be individual. That's not something that we can provide you information on. So, just with any sort of activity that you would be doing at your building, I would tell you to get, multiple estimates so that you can compare them. Ask about certifications, get copies of their certifications so that you can make an informed decision. Something like this, when you're talking about testing, I will say that, you can find different ways that someone will price something to you. They may price it per unit to you, per common area. They may price it to you per room. So there's different ways to be able to compare this, but I can't give you an estimated cost. Same thing on the abatement side. It really is also going to depend on how much lead is found to know how much it's going to cost you to abate the apartment. But as Phil did mention, there is a local law 31 requirement that you have to have your units tested by 2025. So in order to make sure that you are in compliance with that, you have to do the testing anyway. And we're trying to combine the two a little bit in this webinar to make sure that you're informed. There is this requirement to test. If I'm going to comply with this, let me know what's required for exemption so I can make sure that the contractor I'm hiring is doing the testing appropriately, that they're filling out the affidavits. And then if I find any lead, I can make an informed decision on whether or not I'm going to abate that and try to apply for exemption so that I can have some of these requirements under local law 1 removed. So it's really just to kind of inform you, again, this is not a requirement to apply for an exemption. But if you're going to do the local law 131 requirement, which I would encourage you to make sure you are in compliance for, because we will audit for this related to documents for this as well.
Okay, as we wrap things up, I did promise earlier that I was going to show this FAQ on the threshold change. For those of you who have questions about that change to the 0.5 milligrams per square centimeter standard, This is what it looks like. It is available on our website at our lead-based paint page, as I had showed just a little bit earlier. So this is the document you'll be looking for, and uh, there is a lot of information for you to look at on that site. So for those of you, we saw a lot of great questions, and we apologize that we didn't have time to answer all of them. But for those of you who did not get your questions answered, please take a look at our website. And again, you can also call our lead-based paint unit for additional clarification, especially relating to your personal issues. So thanks to everybody for joining us. Again, please take a moment to fill out the survey as you log off, and have a great afternoon. Shireen, any final thoughts?
I just wanted to thank Phil a lot. He had to talk a lot during this presentation. It was a lot of information. I think he did a great job. I know this is a very tough topic. We appreciate everyone hanging in there and going through these questions. It is great that folks, are really engaged and trying to understand this. We know this is a complicated topic. Please tune in to our webinars that are available on the website already now. Any future webinars, we do, however you receive this information, we do send out this information each time we're going to have a new webinar. Please join us back. We go over a lot of different topics related to lead-based paint. Violations is its own webinar. Some folks were sending in questions about violations as well. So we would encourage you just to return, check out our website, return for more webinars in the future. We appreciate you guys trying to do the right thing when it comes to local law requirements.
Okay, thanks again for joining us, everybody, and we will be ending the webinar now. Have a great afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you next time.